Hello students, I am Dr. NAVNEET KAUR, Associate Professor in Electronics and Communication Department, SIRT College. Today I will be taking lecture on subject Digital Communication. The topic of my lecture is Differential PCM. Pulse code modulation is not very efficient system because the message samples are represented by a large number of bits and require large bandwidth to transmit. The samples of the signals are highly correlated with each other. This is because any signal does not change fast. Thus, the adjacent samples of the signal carry the same information with little difference. When these samples are encoded by a standard PCM system, the resulting encoded signal contains redundant information. In analog messages, we can make a good estimate about a sample value from a knowledge of past sample values. In DPCM, at the sampling time k, we transmit the difference between the sample value at sampling time k and sample value at time k minus 1. The difference between the successive samples is much smaller than the sample values. Thus, the peak amplitude of the transmitted signal is reduced considerably. Hence, lesser number of bits are required to represent the different signals. The quantization interval reduces, and thus the quantization noise also reduces. This means for a given transmission bandwidth, signal to noise ratio increases, or for a given signal to noise ratio, we can reduce transmission bandwidth. Thus, we can say DPCM is the process of converting an analog signal into digital signal in which an analog signal is sampled, and then the difference between the actual sample value and the predicted value, which is calculated based on previous samples, is quantized and then encoded, forming a digital value. Now, this is the block diagram of DPCM transmitter. Here at instant k, we have a sampled version of the message mk. Now, instead of transmitting present sample mk, we transmit the difference between the mk and the previous predicted value mk minus 1. Now here we have used predictor for predicting the previous value. A predictor value estimates the actual sample value based on one or more previous samples of the input signal. Thus, in predictor filter, we introduce an input mqk, which is generated by the previous predicted value and the quantized error sample. Now, in this block diagram, we can say that when at instant k, the present sampled value mk arrives, we calculate the difference between the present sample value and the predicted value, which is predicted from the previous sample. The difference between these two samples dk is quantized to the nearest value, which is known as dqk. Now, this dqk will be added with the previous predicted value and will generate mqk. This mqk will be given to the predictor filter, and predictor filter will generate output mqk, which will be compared with the next sampled version of the message signal. So here we can say from the block diagrams, mk is the sampled input, mqk is the predicted sample, dk is the difference of sampled input and predicted output, which is also called prediction error. dqk is the quantized output, and mqk is the predictor input, which is actually the summer output of the predictor output and the quantizer output. Thus, the predictor produces the assumed samples from the previous outputs of the transmitter circuit. The input to this predictor is the quantized versions of the input signal mk. So, the important equations which are considered in DPCM transmitter are discussed here. As shown in block diagram, dk, which is the difference between the present sample mk and the previous predicted value mqk. Now, dk is quantized to generate dqk. Since it is a quantized value, we can say it is the sum of the dk and the quantization error qk. The predicted output MQ cap K is feedback to its input so that the predictor input MQK, which is given as MQ cap K plus DQK. As we already know from this equation that MQ cap K can be given as MK minus DK. So MQ cap K will be generated as MK minus DK and plus DQK will be taken from the equation. Now it will be MK and DQK minus DK is given as QK. So it will be MK plus QK. So we can say that MQK is generated when MK is added to the quantization error. So it is obvious that MQK is the quantized version of the MK. So in this block diagram, MQK is the quantized version of this MK, which is the sampled version of the message signal. So MQK is given to prediction filter, which is a sort of low pass filter. This low pass filter will remove the quantization error from MQK and will generate the signal which will be very much closer to the signal MK. Now, role of predictor. Knowledge of past sample values or difference helps us to predict the range of next required increment or decrement at the predictor output. It reduces the difference between MK and MCAPK. If the difference between them is positive, in that case, we can say that MK is greater than predicted value. So here, the predicted value will try to increase its amplitude to reach the value of MK. So there will be increment in the predictor output. But if the present sample MK is less than the predicted sample, in that case, the difference between them will be negative. And in that case, there will be decrement in the predicted value so that it can reach up to the present sample value. Now, here in this block diagram, we can see DPCM receiver. Here, input DQK. As I have already told you that instead of transmitting MK, we transmit the difference between MK and MQ cap K. And this DK is quantized to generate DQK, which is transmitted. Since DQK is very smaller value in amplitude, so lesser number of bits will be required to encode this. So this will result in reduction of the bandwidth. So this DQK will be transmitted across the channel and will be received at the receiver. This DQK will be added to MQ cap K, which will generate MQK. As I have already discussed in the previous equation, that when MQ cap K is added to DQK, it will generate MQK. So here we can say that DQK is added to MQ cap K, it will generate MQK. And MQK is when given to the predictor, it will generate MQ cap K, which will be added to the next quantized error value and will generate next MQK. Now, since we already know in the previous equation that MQK is the quantized version of the MK. So from this MQK, we can easily generate MK by giving it to the low pass filter, which will reduce the quantization error. So at the receiver, we determine the estimate MQ cap K from previous sample value and generate MQK by adding the received DQK to the estimate MQ cap K. Thus, we reconstruct the sample at the receiver iteratively. Thus, the signal at the receiver differs from actual signal by only quantization error, which can be removed by giving it to the low pass filter. So this is how we will generate our message signal at the receiver side. Now, advantage of DPCM. As the difference between MK and MCAPK is being encoded and transmitted by the PCM technique, a small difference voltage is to be quantized and encoded. This will need less number of quantization level and lesser number of bits will be needed to represent them. The signaling rate and bandwidth of DPCM system will be less than that of PCM. Now, disadvantage of DPCM. It has high bit rate. It needs the predictor circuit to be used, which will add to the cost of the circuit, and the practical usage is limited because the predicted circuit should generate very accurate results. Now, this is all for today's lecture. Thank you.